Everyone in Ashmore Valley said the same thing. Those two kids are going to lose everything. They bought the worst land on the northern frontier, married in a hurry, and then, instead of doing what every sensible farmer would do, Talia Mercer spent their last savings on 63 half-blind ducks nobody wanted. Her husband thought she'd cracked. The neighbors laughed until their sides hurt. But underneath every one of those potato rows, something was hatching. Something that would wipe out the entire valley's harvest by August, unless Talia's impossible idea worked. If you've ever been told your plan was too crazy to survive, watch this story until the end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The farm had a name before Rowan and Talia ever arrived. People called it the Sink, not on any map, not on any deed, just in the way valley people name a place that eats money and gives nothing back. 3 acres of boulder-riddled soil on the northern edge of Ashmore Valley, where the frost came 2 weeks earlier than anywhere else, and the drainage was so poor that standing water collected in the low corners through May. The previous owner, a middle-aged man named Clyde Pershing, had tried potatoes for 4 seasons and quit. He sold the property for less than the equipment on it was worth and moved somewhere with better sense. Rowan Mercer knew all of this. He'd heard it at the feed store, heard it from his uncle, heard it from the woman at the county office who processed the title paperwork, and looked at him with the specific expression of someone trying not to say something rude. He signed anyway. He was 26 years old, and he had exactly 2 options: rent a room above the hardware store in town and work shifts at the grain elevator for the rest of his life, or take the money from his father's insurance settlement and try to build something. He'd chosen the second one. He wasn't sure that made him brave. Some days it just made him the kind of person who didn't know when to quit. Talia was 24, and she'd come into his life sideways. Not a sweeping romance, nothing like that. She was the younger sister of his friend Dell, and she'd spent 3 years working for a livestock supply company out of Millhaven before Dell's wedding pulled her back to the valley. Rowan had met her at the reception and spent most of the evening talking to her about soil pH and drainage culverts, which was not, by any measure, a normal wedding conversation. She hadn't seemed to mind. By the time the cake was cut, she'd told him 3 things that were wrong with his planting plan before he'd even mentioned having one. They got married 8 months later in a small ceremony that cost less than the new fence posts Rowan needed for the back acre. It wasn't romantic exactly. It was practical in the way that 2 people who understand hard work sometimes choose each other. Not because the world is soft, but because it isn't. And having someone beside you matters more than having someone who looks good in a photograph. The first spring on the Sink was honest about how difficult things were going to be. Rowan had borrowed against the property to buy seed stock and basic equipment. The soil tested lower on organic matter than he'd hoped, and clearing the boulder sections in the northeast corner took 3 extra weeks he hadn't budgeted for. By the time they got the first rows planted, they were already behind schedule and already short on the reserve Rowan had kept for emergencies. The word emergency, he was beginning to understand, was essentially a synonym for the month of April. Talia worked beside him without complaint, though complaint wasn't really her style. She had a quality he'd noticed before they married and respected more as time passed. She observed things before she spoke about them. She'd stand at the edge of a field in the morning, just looking before she said anything at all. Sometimes what she said was wrong, but she always had a reason. It was on one of those mornings in early June that she found the eggs. She'd been checking the eastern rows, crouching down between the mounded soil to look at the new growth, and she'd turned over a clod of earth near the base of a young plant and seen them, pale, clustered, smaller than a match head. She didn't panic. She pulled out the worn pocket notebook she kept in her jacket and sketched the shape of them, noted the location, and then walked methodically through the next 40 feet of row doing the same thing. By the time she got back to where Rowan was working the irrigation line, she'd counted what she estimated to be several thousand eggs across a 100-foot stretch. "Colorado potato beetle," she said, "but a lot of them. More than I've seen." Rowan straightened up. He was sweaty and tired, and his lower back had been bothering him since Tuesday. "How many?" "Enough that if they hatch and we don't have a response plan, we lose the field." She said it the same way she'd say the weather was going to turn. Factual, flat, like she was reading a number off a gauge. "And if they're here, they're probably across the whole valley. The wind's been out of the south for 2 weeks." He looked at the rows behind her. Everything looked fine from where he stood. Healthy green growth, nothing visibly wrong. That was the problem with eggs. They didn't look like anything until they became everything. Pesticide? We can't afford enough to cover the whole field, and even if we could, the runoff risk on this drainage situation. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The culvert on the north end was already borderline, and a heavy pesticide application followed by rain would put them in violation of the watershed restrictions the county had tightened last year. The fine alone would finish them. Rowan pressed his hands against his thighs and looked out at the valley. Across the road, and a quarter-mile south, he could see the green geometry of Silas Granger's fields, clean, organized, 10 times the acreage of anything Rowan owned. Granger had farmed Ashmore Valley for 30 years. He had equipment, storage, a crew of 4 seasonals, and the kind of reputation that came from outlasting everyone who ever doubted him. He'd looked at Rowan's property once, from the road, and said without being asked that the soil on the northern edge wasn't worth the diesel it took to work it. Rowan didn't say anything about Granger. He pulled off his cap and turned it in his hands. "So what do we do?" Talia had her notebook open. She didn't answer right away. She'd been thinking about it since she'd found the eggs, actually. That was how her brain worked. She'd already been running through options while she was still crouching in the dirt sketching, already weighing what they had against what they needed. And she'd come back to something she'd seen 3 days ago, about 4 miles up the county road. The Harwick operation had gone under in March. Earl Harwick had run a mixed farm, some grain, some vegetables, and an unusual side operation, a flock of Indian runner ducks he'd kept for pest management and egg production. When the bank called in the loan, everything went with it. The grain got auctioned. The equipment sold in 2 hours. But the ducks, 63 of them, a genetically unusual line that ran heavy toward near blindness due to decades of inbreeding on Earl's part, nobody wanted. There'd been a notice in the Millhaven Courier that the birds were available for next to nothing, or they'd be put down by the end of the month. Talia had read the notice and moved on at the time. Now she was thinking about it differently. Indian runner ducks were ground foragers. They didn't swim much. They walked, upright and purposeful, nosing through soil and low vegetation for insects. They ate beetles, larvae, eggs, if they could find them. Earl Harwick had used them in his vegetable rows for years, though without much system behind it, just letting them roam and hoping for the best. But Talia had been thinking about what would happen if you didn't just let them roam. What if you gave them a path? Potato rows were roughly 2 feet wide. A narrow corridor of woven willow, staked low to the ground, could funnel the birds down a specific row, force them to walk the length of it, nose to the soil, hunting. The near blindness that made the ducks nearly worthless for egg production would become an advantage in that context. Close to the ground, moving slowly, those birds would be working by smell and touch, not sight. They'd miss nothing at ground level. She explained it to Rowan standing at the irrigation line. He listened without interrupting, which was something she'd always liked about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The sun was high and the heat was starting to build, and somewhere across the valley a tractor engine coughed to life. "You want to build little duck hallways," he said. "Willow branch corridors." "Yes." "Down every row." "Not every row. Rotate them. 3 rows at a time, move the flock through, then shift to the next section." He thought about it. The willow was free. There was a stand of it down by the creek that nobody was using. The stakes would cost something. Time would cost more. And the ducks? How much for the birds? Earl's estate is asking $40 for the whole flock, which means they'll take $25. Rowan did the math in his head. $25 for 63 ducks was less than 50 cents a bird. It was probably the cheapest livestock purchase in the history of Ashmore Valley. "And you think it'll work?" "I think it could work," she said, which was different. "I think we don't have a better option." He stood there for another moment. He could already hear what people would say. He could already picture the look on Granger's face. "All right," he said, "go get the ducks." She came back the next afternoon with 63 Indian runner ducks loaded in 4 wooden crates in the bed of their truck. And she also came back with a receipt for $18 because she'd been right about the negotiation. Rowan was waiting in the yard. He watched her pull in, watched the truck settle under the weight of all those crates, and then watched as she got out and opened the tailgate. The ducks there was no flattering way to describe them. They were thin, somewhat bedraggled, and they moved with the particular uncertain quality of animals that genuinely could not see well. They had the upright posture of the Indian runner breed, necks long and heads tilted, but they walked into each other, walked into the crate walls, tilted their heads at angles that suggested they were working hard to compensate for what their eyes weren't providing. "These are the ones," Rowan said. It wasn't really a question. "These are the ones." He reached into the nearest crate and let one duck walk its beak across his palm. It found the edge of his hand, turned its head sideways, and made a low questioning sound. "Okay," he said. "Okay." They built the first corridor that afternoon. Talia had done the measurements already. The willow branches needed to come in at roughly 18 inches from the ground at the base, angled out to maybe 24 inches at the top, creating a soft funnel shape that would guide the ducks without stressing them. The stakes were simple. She'd spent 2 evenings sharpening lengths of cedar she'd cut from the edge of their property. The weave itself was the time-consuming part, lacing the green willow branches through the stakes in a loose basketwork pattern that would hold shape without being rigid. By sunset, they had one corridor 80 feet long down the first row on the eastern section. Rowan looked at it in the fading light. "It looks like something a child built," he said. "It works," Talia said. That's what matters. You haven't tested it yet." "Then let's test it." They brought 3 ducks from the pen they'd set up in the barn, a converted half-stall with clean straw and a water trough, and guided them to the corridor entrance. For a moment, nothing happened. The ducks stood at the opening, heads tilted, clicking softly to each other. Then the one in the middle walked in. It moved down the row slowly, that peculiar upright stride, head swinging low every few steps, beak dipping to the soil. The other 2 followed. All 3 worked the ground as they moved, and Rowan watched one of them snap at something near the base of a plant stem, something he couldn't see from where he was standing. "It's working," he said quietly. "Let's not celebrate yet." But Talia's voice had something in it. Not quite relief, not quite triumph. Just the sound of someone who'd thought hard about a problem and found out their thinking had been correct. Gitam. The news traveled the way news traveled in a small agricultural valley, at the feed store, at the gas station, over fence lines, through the particular telephone network of farm spouses who knew everything before anyone admitted it. Within a week, everyone in Ashmore Valley knew that the young couple at the sink had bought Earl Harwick's blind ducks and were running them through willow mazes in their potato field. The response was not kind. Rowan heard it first from Marcus Webb, who ran the farm supply store in town and who delivered this information with a face struggling to stay neutral. "People are saying you've lost the plot." "What people?" "Most of them." Marcus set a box of fence staples on the counter. "Granger was in here Monday. Said you're playing house instead of farming." Rowan took the staples. "Granger's welcome to come watch. He also said—" Marcus paused. "He said the ducks look malnourished, that it might be a welfare situation." Rowan went still. Marcus kept his eyes on the counter. "I'm just telling you what's going around." It wasn't true. Talia had put the ducks on a supplemental grain ration from day one, not because they needed it while the pest population was high. They were eating well off the beetles in the rows, but because she was careful that way, always calculating for the variable she hadn't accounted for yet. The ducks were thin when they'd arrived, but after 3 weeks they were filling out. Anyone who looked at them honestly could see it. But Silas Granger wasn't looking honestly. Silas Granger was looking with the particular focus of a man who'd decided something before he started looking. He was 54 years old, built wide and solid, with a farmer's hands and a politician's instinct for how information moved through a small community. His family had been in Ashmore Valley for 3 generations. He wasn't a cruel man, exactly. Rowan had thought about this and decided cruelty wasn't the right word. He was the kind of man who had succeeded by doing things a certain way and had come to believe that his way was the right way by definition. New ideas were, to Silas Granger, primarily a form of arrogance. Young people with strange plans were primarily a form of disorder. The welfare rumor was enough. 2 other farmers repeated it. One of them, a man named Phil Bauer, said it loud enough at the grain elevator that 3 people heard it, and one of them mentioned it to Talia directly. She came home that evening quieter than usual. Rowan was at the kitchen table with the account book, running numbers he didn't like. He looked up when she came in. "I heard," he said. She took off her jacket and hung it on the hook by the door. Her boots had mud on them to the ankle. "I know the birds are fine," she said. "I know you know. I just—" She stopped, sat down across from him, pressed her palms flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "I'm not going to let him make this about the animals. The animals are fine. They're better than fine. They're doing what I thought they'd do, and the rows they've been through look different already. You can see the difference." "I know." "So why does it bother me this much?" Rowan closed the account book. "Because it's not fair, and you know it's not fair, and you can't fix it by being right." She looked at him for a second. "No," she said. "I guess I can't." Outside, across the potato field, the willow corridors stood in the long evening light, pale and temporary looking, while 63 near-blind ducks moved through the rows in their quiet, purposeful way, eating everything that was trying to destroy the harvest. The corridors took 3 full weeks to build across the entire active field. Talia designed them in sections. She had a hand-drawn map, pencil on the back of a seed catalog, with the field divided into 7 working zones, and the flock rotation marked out in a schedule that accounted for both pest density and recovery time. She was up before sunrise most mornings. She came in after dark most nights. Her hands were rough from the willow work. She went through a pair of gloves every 6 days. Rowan helped with the construction when he wasn't managing the irrigation or handling the endless list of other things a 3-acre operation demanded. He was not, he would have freely admitted, the one with the plan here. His job was to make the plan possible, to fix what broke, to haul what needed hauling, to keep the secondary systems from failing while the primary one absorbed all the attention. He also talked to the ducks more than he expected to. It started practically. Talia used a specific whistle pattern to call the flock, 2 short notes and a long one, and Rowan had learned it because it was faster than herding 63 birds by hand. But somewhere in the 3rd week he'd started talking to them while he guided them, not full sentences, just commentary, the kind of low-voice narration that came out when a person was doing physical work alone. He told them about the account book. He told them the rain was coming Thursday, and he wasn't sure if that was good or bad. He told the one he'd started calling Patch, she had an unusual dark marking over one eye, that she was eating more than her share, and he respected that about her. Talia caught him once. She didn't say anything, she just had a certain look. "They're better when you talk to them," he said without a great deal of conviction. "Are they? The rows they've done this week are cleaner than the ones from before." She thought about it. Maybe. By the end of June, the eastern section showed a measurable difference. Rowan had gone through those rows on his hands and knees before the ducks started, noting egg clusters, logging their density per square foot in the account book. He went through again after 2 passes with the flock, and the reduction was significant enough that he checked his numbers twice, because he didn't want to be wrong about something he wanted to be right about. He brought the notebook to Talia at dinner. She looked at the numbers for a long time. "It's working," she said. "Better than expected." "Don't say that." She pushed the notebook back across the table. "When you say better than expected, you stop watching for what could still go wrong." He pulled the notebook back. "You're not going to let me be happy about this for 5 minutes, are you?" "You can be happy. Just stay careful." But she was almost smiling. Outside, a night bird called from the creek. The ducks were in their barn stall, settled for the night, the specific low sound of their sleeping moving through the walls. It wasn't quiet, exactly. A farm is never quiet. But it was the particular sound of things that were, for the moment, going more or less correctly, which was, Rowan thought, about as good as things ever got. But it was the first week of July when Silas Granger came in person. Rowan saw him from the field, the big green pickup slowing on the county road, then turning in at the gate as if Granger had simply decided the gate was an invitation, and Rowan's driveway was something he had the right to use. He pulled up 20 feet from where Rowan was working a section of fencing and got out without hurrying, the way a man gets out of a truck when he's used to people waiting for him. He was bigger up close than he looked from a distance, wide-shouldered, with a face that had spent decades in wind and sun and looked like it. "Mercer," he said. "Mr. Granger." Rowan set his fence pliers down and straightened up. Granger looked at the field. He looked at the willow corridors running between the rows, at the section where 3 ducks were moving through their rotation, at the hand-painted signs Talia had put at the zone boundaries to keep track of the schedule. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he's already decided is wrong. "I heard about your system," Granger said. "I imagine you have. I want to be straight with you." Granger turned to look at him directly, not unkindly, with the expression of someone delivering information they've decided the other person needs. "I've been farming this valley longer than you've been alive. What you're doing here," he gestured at the field, "it's not sustainable. Beetles don't care about ducks. When the pressure builds in July, you're going to get overwhelmed, and those birds aren't going to save you." Rowan looked at him. Okay. Granger seemed slightly thrown by the absence of argument. "I hear what you're saying." Rowan picked up the fence pliers. "I don't agree with it, but I hear it." Granger's jaw tightened a little. "I'm also going to be honest with you about the welfare situation. People are watching how you're treating those animals, and if there's a reason to bring the county in, somebody will." "The ducks are healthy," Rowan said. "Anyone who wants to come look at them is welcome. I'm just telling you what I know." "You're telling me what you've decided." Rowan met his eyes. "There's a difference." Something shifted in Granger's expression. Not anger, quite. Something more like surprise that there was pushback at all. He looked at the field again. One of the ducks near the corridor entrance had stopped and was working its beak at the base of a plant stem, head tilted completely sideways, deeply committed to something in the soil. "Your wife's idea," Granger said. "Talia's idea, yes." Granger nodded once, slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already thought. He got back in the truck without saying anything else and pulled out of the driveway and turned onto the county road. Rowan watched him go. He stood there until the green truck was gone from sight, and then he crouched down beside the nearest corridor section and picked up a small clod of earth and turned it over. No eggs. He turned over another. Nothing. He moved along the row, checking until he'd gone 20 feet, and found 2 small clusters, pale and dense and very much present, in the section they hadn't rotated through yet. He found Talia at the barn making notes on her map. "Granger came," he said. She didn't look up right away. "What did he want?" "To let me know he thinks we're going to fail." Now she looked up. She read his face for a moment. "Did he threaten the welfare thing?" "Mentioned it." She set the map down. "He's scared." "Of a potato farm." "Of being wrong," she said. "That's different from scared of us." "He's not scared of us." She picked the map up again. "He's scared that this works, and he's the one who said it wouldn't." Rowan thought about that. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "I don't know, does it?" He thought about it. "A little," he admitted. The ducks moved in the barn behind her, shifting in the straw, 63 of them settling into the particular stillness of animals at ease. Outside, the July heat was climbing, and the sky was hard and white at the edges where the sun bore down on the valley, and somewhere out there the egg clusters were still hatching, and the larvae were still moving, and the whole precarious system they'd built on the back of $18 worth of unwanted ducks was still, improbably, holding together. Rowan looked at his wife. She was already writing again, her pen moving quickly across the back of the catalog page, adjusting the rotation schedule for the coming week. Her hair was tied back roughly, and there was a smear of willow bark on her left forearm, and she was completely, utterly focused on the problem in front of her. He thought about how he'd spent the first year after his father died feeling like he didn't know where to put himself in the world. He thought about how that feeling had not entirely gone away, and he thought that whatever happened with the Beetles, whatever happened with the harvest, whatever Silas Granger told the neighbors, this woman and her ridiculous, brilliant, half-blind ducks had given him somewhere to be. It wasn't nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. He went back to the fence line and picked up his pliers and kept working. The heat broke wrong in July. It came in fast and stayed, the kind of heat that sat on the valley like something with weight, pressing down on the soil and pulling moisture out of everything it touched. The creek behind the property dropped 6 inches in 2 weeks. The willow stands along the bank went dry at the tips, and Talia had to change her cutting schedule, harvesting branches earlier in the morning before the day took the flexibility out of them. Small things, but small things had a way of adding up on a farm that had no slack in it. What came with the heat was worse. The beetle larvae hatched across the valley in numbers that nobody had predicted. Not just on the sink, everywhere. Phil Bauer's operation, 2 miles south, lost a quarter of his field in 10 days. The Hendersons on the East Road watched their early crop go from healthy to skeletal in a stretch so fast that old Dale Henderson said afterward, it looked like something had just decided to eat it. The larvae were in the soil, in the leaf axils, in the mounded rows, everywhere at once. The particular devastation of a pest that had found ideal conditions and was taking full advantage. Rowan walked Bauer's field on a Thursday, at Bauer's invitation, and stood in the middle of a row that 3 weeks ago had been the most productive section on the property. The plants were stripped to their stems in places. The soil between the mounds was moving, not metaphorically, actually moving, with the slow churn of larvae working through it. He drove home and sat in the truck in the driveway for a few minutes before he went inside. Talia was at the kitchen table with her map. She'd redrawn it twice already, revising the rotation schedule as the pest pressure shifted week to week. The map was covered in pencil marks and corrections. Zone boundaries moved, timing adjusted, arrows showing where the flock had been and where they needed to go. It looked like the inside of a very complicated argument. Bowers lost a quarter, Rowan said. She didn't look up. I know. Marcus told me this morning. Henderson's worse. I know that too. She set the pencil down. How are our east rows? Better than they should be. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. That's the honest answer. They're not perfect. There's still activity in the uncorked sections we haven't run the flock through yet. But the completed zones... He stopped because he didn't want to oversell it. The completed zones are holding. She nodded, picked up the pencil again. We need to get to the center section by the end of next week. If the hatch pattern follows what I think it's going to follow, the pressure is going to concentrate there in about 10 days. That's aggressive. I know it's aggressive. The flock needs recovery time, Talia. If we push them through too fast, they stop working. They get tired. They start missing things. I know. She said it sharply, then stopped herself. Took a breath. I know. I'm trying to find the balance. She tapped the pencil against the edge of the table. 4 zones active at once instead of 3. We split the flock. 3 groups instead of 2, smaller per corridor. Shorter runs, more rotations. Give them rest between. Rowan thought about it. That means more corridor maintenance. The weave on Zone 4 is already starting to pull loose on the south end. I'll fix it this afternoon. You were up at 4:30 this morning. And I'll be up at 4:30 tomorrow morning too. She looked at him across the table, not unkind, but definite. Rowan, we don't have another option here. We run the system harder or we lose to it. Those are the choices. He didn't argue. She was right, and they both knew it. The intensified schedule started the next day. Splitting the flock was harder than either of them expected. Not logistically. The birds moved easily enough in small groups by now, responding to the whistle pattern Talia had trained into them over weeks of repetition. But emotionally, in the specific way that any plan that looks simple on paper reveals its complications when you're actually in the mud doing it. The 3-group rotation required both of them to be in different sections of the field simultaneously, which meant Rowan was managing 20 ducks on his own through a corridor stretch without Talia's eye on the zone, and twice in the first 3 days he brought them through a section she'd already scheduled for rest and had to hear about it at dinner. Zone 3 was on a 48-hour break, she said, pointing at the map. I know, I made a mistake. If we exhaust that section before the second hatch, I know, Talia, I made a mistake. I'll follow the map. She pressed her lips together, looked at the map. It's okay, she said, which was what she said when it wasn't entirely okay, but she'd decided to move past it. They ate the rest of that dinner without talking much, which wasn't unusual. Tiredness had a way of using up the words. The physical work was what got to Rowan more than anything else. Not the hours. He'd worked long hours before and could tolerate it. It was the specificity of the exhaustion, the crouching, the lifting, the constant low-grade attention required to manage animals and corridor and soil condition all at once. His shoulders ached in a way that didn't fully resolve overnight. His hands had calluses on calluses. He was losing weight without trying to, because they were burning more calories than they were managing to put back in, eating quickly and late, and falling asleep in the kind of dense unconscious way that meant the body had simply hit a limit and shut off. Talia was thinner too. He noticed it one morning when she was pulling a section of willow branch loose from a damaged corridor panel. Her arms extended above her, and he could see the lines of her shoulder blades through her shirt. He thought about saying something and didn't. She was fine. She would say she was fine. He was fine too, technically. Fine was just the word they used for the condition of people who were doing more than they should be able to do. The damaged corridor was a problem they hadn't fully anticipated. Green willow was durable, but not indestructible. The weave panels held up well for the first month, but under the stress of daily duck traffic, accumulated moisture from the irrigation schedule, and the July heat, sections began to degrade in the 5th week. Stakes pulled loose, woven panels sagged and opened gaps wide enough for a duck to push through sideways, which they did, because 63 near-blind ducks discovering a gap in a fence were apparently not above taking advantage of it. On a Tuesday afternoon, Rowan arrived at Zone 2 to find 11 ducks who had exited their corridor and were conducting their own free-range investigation of the adjacent rows, which were not scheduled for rotation and which Talia had specifically marked as a rest zone. He stood there for a moment. The ducks moved around him with complete indifference, heads tilting, beaks working at the soil, doing exactly what he'd wanted them to do, but in exactly the wrong place. "Okay," he said. To no one. To the ducks. To himself. "Okay." He spent 2 hours getting them back in order and another hour repairing the section of corridor. By the time he'd finished, the afternoon light was going, and he hadn't done the irrigation check or the account book entry he'd meant to do. He stood at the edge of the field with dirt on his hands and knees and looked at the whole system. The corridors threading through the rows, the ducks visible in Zone 1 still working their late rotation, the hand-painted zone markers, the whole strange construction of it, and felt something he didn't immediately have a word for. Not failure. Not yet. But the weight of how much could still go wrong. He thought about what Bowers Field had looked like, all those stripped stems. He went inside and washed up and didn't mention the gap to Talia until after dinner, when he brought it up in the context of the maintenance schedule. "I know about the gap," she said. "You knew?" "I checked Zone 2 this morning. I added it to the repair list." She turned the list toward him. There were 7 items on it in her small, precise handwriting. "Why didn't you say something?" She shrugged one shoulder. "Because I knew you'd get it." He looked at the list. Item 4 was his name, with the Zone 2 corridor reference. She'd written it before he'd even found the problem. "You do this a lot," he said. You already know about the thing, and you wait for me to find it. Sometimes." She pulled the list back. "You retain it better if you find it yourself." He wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or grateful, and couldn't quite decide, so he let it go. The rumor situation worsened in the 3rd week of July. It came through Marcus again, because Marcus was the kind of man who felt that honesty required him to pass along information whether or not the recipient wanted it. He pulled Rowan aside at the supply store on a Wednesday and said that Silas Granger had been talking at the Millhaven Cooperative meeting, in front of 12 farmers and 2 bank representatives, about the welfare situation on the sink. He'd used the word neglect. He'd said he'd seen the animals from the road, and they didn't look right, and that someone ought to file a formal complaint before the season ended. Rowan drove home with the bag of steaks in the truck bed and the information sitting in his chest like something with an edge. He didn't tell Talia right away. He told her that evening, after they'd finished the late rotation and locked the birds in for the night, sitting on the porch in the last of the day's heat with 2 cups of bad coffee. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He said neglect," she said. "That's what Marcus said, in front of bank people." "Yes." She turned the coffee cup in both hands. Didn't drink from it. "Our loan review is in September," she said. Rowan had thought about that too. "I know." "If someone files a formal complaint before the review..." She stopped, started again. "I'm not saying it would change anything. I'm saying it doesn't help." "No. He's doing it because the system is working," she said. She said it quietly, without heat. "The rest of the valley is getting hammered, and our field is holding, and he can see that from the road, probably. So he's..." She shook her head. "He's finding a different angle." "What do we do?" She thought about it. "We invite someone out here," she said, "before he can file anything. We call the county extension office. We ask them to come do an observation. We put everything on the record. Let them see the birds. Let them see the field. She looked at him. If there's nothing wrong, and there isn't anything wrong, then it's documented. He can't use a complaint to muddy something that's already been cleared. It was the right call. Rowan knew it immediately, the way you know when someone else has thought faster and cleaner than you have about a problem. All right, he said. I'll call tomorrow. The extension agent who came out was a woman named Sandra Poole, early 50s, with a no-nonsense manner and the specific quality of someone who had seen a great many unusual things in the course of her career and was not easily impressed or easily alarmed. She walked the field with Talia for an hour and a half, examining the corridors, watching the flock work a rotation, checking the barn setup, looking at the feed records Talia produced from the account book. She crouched down at the entrance to Zone 3 and watched 3 ducks work 20 feet of row without saying anything. Then she stood up and looked at Talia. They're well fed, she said. Their condition is good. The housing is appropriate for the breed. She looked at the corridor. And this is your design? Yes. How long did it take you to develop it? I thought about it for 2 days before we started. I've been adjusting it since. Sandra Poole wrote something in her notebook. I'm going to be honest with you, Mrs. Mercer. I've been doing this for 22 years and I've never seen anything quite like what you've built here. That's not a criticism. She looked at the field again. Your pest pressure numbers? Do you have documentation? Talia had documentation. She had the account book entries, the before and after measurements from the east section, the weekly zone assessments she'd been logging since the first rotation. She handed Sandra Poole the account book and stood while the agent went through it. Sandra handed it back. I'm going to file my observation report this week. There's nothing here that constitutes a welfare concern. She glanced toward the road, toward the direction of Granger's property, in a way that suggested she was not entirely unaware of how these visits sometimes originated. And Mrs. Mercer, off the record, whoever raised this concern might want to spend less time looking at your field and more time looking at their own. After she left, Talia stood in the driveway for a moment. Rowan came to stand beside her. Good, he said. Yes. She turned toward the barn. I need to check the Zone 5 fence before dark. He almost said something about the fact that she should eat something first, that it was past 6 and she hadn't stopped since 7 in the morning. He didn't say it because she knew that already and it wouldn't change anything. He just walked with her. That was the week the valley's situation got visibly bad enough that people stopped pretending otherwise. By the last week of July, Dale Henderson had lost the majority of his early season planting. The Marconi brothers on the West Road, who ran the second largest potato operation in the valley, were talking openly about writing off the season entirely. At the cooperative, people were calculating losses in terms that involved the word foreclosure. The beetle population had exploded past what any preventive treatment could address. The county had issued a general advisory recommending additional pesticide applications. But the timing was wrong and the scale was too large, and it was, by most experienced assessments, closing the barn door after the horses had already left. Rowan walked his own field every morning. He walked it slowly, the way Talia had taught him to, crouching to check the soil in the worked zones, running his hand along the plant stems, pulling back the mounded earth to look at what was underneath. The zones the flock had completed were clean. Not perfect, not zero activity, but clean enough. The zones in current rotation were managing. The zones not yet scheduled were showing pressure, some of it significant, and those were the ones that kept him up at 2 in the morning doing math in his head. On a Friday evening near the end of the month, he and Talia stood at the north edge of the field and looked south across the valley. In the flat horizontal light of 7 o'clock, you could see the difference. Their field was green, not uniformly, not perfectly. There were sections where the plants were stressed, where the growth was thinner than he'd have liked, where the system had been late getting to and the damage was visible. But it was green, standing, growing, producing. The fields to the south, the ones that had been beautiful in June, were not green. They were the color of failure, yellow and brown and bare in stretches, with the particular sad geometry of rows that had held something and no longer held anything. We might actually do this, Rowan said. Talia was quiet beside him. I'm not trying to oversell it, he said. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. She had her arms crossed, not closed off, just holding herself. The evening was cooling, the first real relief of the day. We're not there yet, but we're closer than anybody thought we'd be. She looked at the field for another moment. 63 ducks were finishing their last rotation of the day in Zone 6, visible as a slow, dark movement between the rows, unhurried, purposeful, doing the thing they had been trained over weeks to do. She'd spent those weeks walking with them, whistling them through the corridors, standing at the end of each row while they worked, present and patient, in the way that only someone who had bet everything on an idea could afford to be. Closer, she said. Yes. The corridor in Zone 4 failed completely 2 days later. A section 12 feet long collapsed inward during the night, the stakes pulling free in the softened soil after the irrigation ran long. And when Rowan came out in the morning, he found the damage and stood there looking at it with the specific feeling of someone who has been waiting for the bad thing and now it has arrived. He repaired it in 4 hours. His back was bad the whole time. That night, after dinner, after the birds were locked in and the field was dark, and the valley was quiet in the way it got quiet sometimes when the wind dropped and the crickets were between songs, Talia said something that surprised him. "I'm tired," she said. "Not as a complaint, just as a fact." "I know," he said. "I don't mean today tired." She was looking at the table. "I mean, I'm not sure how much more I have." She looked up. "Don't take that wrong. I'm not quitting. I'm just being honest." "I know what you mean," he said. And he did, because he felt the same thing. Not the desire to stop, but the awareness that the thing they were running on was not renewable. That somewhere under the determination and the schedule and the account book math, there was a person who had been working at full capacity for too long. "Tell me the birds are going to be okay," she said. It was a strange thing for her to ask, because she was not usually a person who asked for reassurance. He thought about it. "The birds are going to be okay," he said. She nodded once. "Okay." She stood up from the table and went to get ready for bed, and he sat there for a few more minutes with the lamp on, looking at the map she'd left on the table, all those pencil marks and corrections and adjustments, the entire running record of a person trying to outthink a problem that hadn't wanted to be outthought. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. Outside, something rustled at the edge of the property, and then went quiet, and the farm settled into the dark. The fox came on a Wednesday night, in the second week of August, 2 days before what Talia's tracking map estimated would be the final and largest beetle hatch of the season. Rowan didn't hear it happen. That was the part that stayed with him afterward, that he'd been 30 feet away sleeping, while the whole thing came apart. The fox had found a gap in the barn's side panel, an old repair that had held through spring and most of summer, but had apparently decided that August was a reasonable time to give up. It got in some time after midnight. By the time the noise woke Rowan, a sound he couldn't immediately identify, somewhere between chaos and alarm, coming through the barn wall, it had already been in there long enough to do serious damage. He came out of bed fast and hit the porch in his boots without tying them and crossed the yard at a run. The barn door was latched from the outside, which meant the fox had gone in through the panel and not the door. And when he opened it and the flashlight swept the interior, what he saw stopped him for a full second before his body caught up. Ducks everywhere. Not in the stall. Everywhere. Pushed to every corner, jammed against equipment, some of them on the workbench, some pressed into the gap behind the water barrel. The pen section was destroyed. The low wooden divider knocked flat. The straw was torn up and scattered. In the far corner, the fox, young, maybe half-grown, no bigger than a large cat, looked at him from behind a fallen bucket with an expression that was mostly terror and a little defiance. He got the fox out through the side panel it had come in by. It didn't take long. The animal was more frightened than he was by that point and went out fast. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at the ducks. Talia appeared beside him. She'd pulled on her jacket over her nightshirt, and her hair was loose, and she had the look of someone who has gone from deep sleep to full alert in under a minute. She didn't say anything. She just looked. "They're alive," Rowan said. "All of them, I think. I don't see—" He moved the flashlight. "I don't see any injuries." "The panel's been compromised since June," she said. Her voice was flat in the way it got when she was controlling something. "I kept meaning to fix it." "So did I." She walked into the barn and started moving through the ducks slowly, checking each one, running her hands along wing joints and bodies, tilting heads into the flashlight. The ducks were agitated, a continuous, unsettled sound, nothing like their usual sleeping quiet, and some of them moved away from her hands, but they let her check. They knew her by now. They knew her touch. "They're okay," she said finally. "Stressed, but okay." Rowan let out a breath he'd been holding without knowing it. "Okay, good." He ran a hand through his hair. "I'll fix the panel tonight." "It's 2 a.m. If another one comes in..." "I know." She looked around the barn. "I'll help." They fixed the panel by flashlight, which was slow and awkward and involved Rowan holding the light in his teeth for 15 minutes, while Talia drove nails one-handed into wet wood that didn't want to cooperate. They got the pen section upright again and got most of the ducks back into it, the ones that would go. Some of them had settled where they'd landed and showed no interest in moving, and Talia said leave them. They'd sort themselves out by morning, which they did. He went back to bed around 3:30. He didn't sleep. He lay there in the dark, and he thought about the map on the kitchen table, and about how in 2 days the final hatch was supposed to come, and about what the field looked like right now. The corridors, the zone markers, the whole architecture of the system Talia had built over the last 3 months. And then he thought about what he hadn't said to Talia in the barn, what he'd been thinking while he watched her check each duck in the flashlight's beam. He was afraid it wasn't going to be enough. He'd been afraid of that for weeks, maybe longer. And he hadn't said it because saying it felt like removing a pin from something structural. But lying in the dark at 3:30 in the morning with 2 days left before the biggest hatch of the season, he thought about Bowers Field and Henderson's Field in the Marconi operation, and he thought about the loan review in September, and the specific arithmetic of what losing the harvest would actually mean for 2 people who had no reserve and no backup plan. He heard Talia turn over beside him. "You're not sleeping," she said. Not a question. "No." Silence for a moment. "The birds are fine," she said. "I know. The field is... I know the field is okay right now, Talia. I know." He stared at the ceiling. "I'm worried about the hatch. 2 days. And the corridors in zones 3 and 6 are already showing stress. And if we push the flock too hard to get the coverage we need before... Rowan, I'm just thinking through it." "I know you are. Stop for a minute and sleep." "I can't." She didn't say anything else. He heard her breathing in the dark, and eventually, sometime after 4, the exhaustion won, and he went under. He was wrong about the fox coming only once. It came back the following night. A different one, or the same one. It didn't matter. And this time it didn't get into the barn. This time it got into Zone 4. Rowan found it at 6 in the morning when he came out for the first rotation check. He stood at the edge of Zone 4 and looked at what remained of the northern corridor section and felt something go quiet inside him that had been loud for a long time. A third of the willow maze was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. The stakes had been pulled or knocked over, the woven panels torn through and scattered, the careful geometry of the corridor system reduced to a pile of sticks and broken weave across 30 feet of row. Some of the damage was fox. Some of it was ducks. He could see where they'd scattered through the gaps, trampling the panels in their blind panic, compounding the destruction without meaning to. He counted what was still intact. Zone 1 mostly. Zone 2, fully. Zone 5, fully. Parts of Zone 3. Zone 6, questionable. Zones 4 and 7 were effectively gone. The coverage map Talia had built over 3 months of incremental construction had a hole in it now, right in the center section, right where the final hatch pressure was going to concentrate. He stood there for a long time. Talia came out 20 minutes later. She'd been in the barn doing the morning check, and she walked across the field toward him, and he watched her face as she got close enough to see what he was looking at. She stopped, took it in, didn't speak. 2 days, he said. We've got 2 days before the hatch, and we've lost a third of the system. She crouched down at the edge of the destruction and picked up a section of broken willow panel, looked at it, set it down. We can't rebuild it in time, Rowan said. Not to the standard it needs to be to hold the flock. Even if we started right now and worked until dark today and tomorrow, I know. So what do we do? She didn't answer right away. She stayed crouched, looking at the damaged rows, and Rowan knew that look. It was the same one she got when she was running through a problem, when she was turning something over and looking at its other side. He'd seen it over the account book and over the seed catalog map and over the schedule revisions she'd done half a dozen times. He'd learned to wait it out. He waited. The morning light was coming in flat and low over the eastern ridge, the kind of light that made everything look simultaneously clear and a little harsh, and the valley below them was quiet in the way it got before the heat came up. Somewhere in Zone 2, he could hear ducks moving in the corridor. The early group, the ones Talia had released before she came out here, still working, still doing what they'd been trained to do. Talia stood up. "We don't need the maze," she said. He looked at her. "We haven't needed it for weeks," she said, and her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not excitement, not relief, but the specific quality of someone who has just seen something clearly that was there the whole time. "I've been thinking about it wrong. The corridors were for training. They were to teach the birds the pattern. Walk the row, nose to the ground, follow the line. But they know the pattern now. They've been doing it for 3 months. They follow you," Rowan said slowly. The thing she was saying was coming together in his head. "They follow the whistle. They follow me. I can walk them down a row without the corridor. I've been doing it in the damaged sections already, without thinking about it as a system. When the weave pulls loose, I just walk ahead of them and they follow." She looked at the destroyed section. "We don't rebuild. We abandon the whole structure, all of it, tonight before the hatch. We take down what's left, clear the rows, and we run the flock free range with me on the whistle. All 63 free range across the whole field, with me leading and you on the other end of each row shaking the larvae from the plants into the path." She looked at him. "You shake the stems, the larvae fall, the ducks take them. It's faster than the corridors, more coverage. We can do the whole field in 2 days if we start at first light." Rowan thought about it. He thought about 63 near-blind ducks moving through open rows with nothing to guide them but a whistle and a woman walking ahead of them in the dirt. He thought about everything that could go wrong. Scattering, missing sections, ducks that decided today was the day they didn't feel like cooperating. He also thought about Zone 4, and about the loan review, and about Bowers Field. "If it doesn't work," he started. "If it doesn't work, we lose what we were already going to lose," Talia said. "The corridors are gone. Standing here arguing about it doesn't change that." She picked up the broken panel again and held it for a moment, then dropped it. "This was always the plan underneath the plan. I just didn't know it until now." He didn't have a better argument than that. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Tonight we take down the rest. Tomorrow morning we start." What? They spent that evening dismantling what remained of the Willow system. It was strange work, pulling down something they'd built with that much effort, carrying the stakes and panels to the edge of the property and stacking them, clearing the row ends of debris so the ducks would have clean passage. There was something that felt like loss in it, even though it was the right call. Talia worked without sentiment, pulling stakes and coiling the leftover willow lengths and setting them aside with the methodical efficiency she brought to everything. But Rowan caught her pausing once, holding a section of panels she'd woven herself on a June evening that felt like a different year, looking at it without expression. "You all right?" he said. "Fine." She set it on the pile. "Just 3 months." "I know." She dusted her hands against her jeans and kept going. He kept going too. By full dark, the field was clear. It looked bigger without the corridors, more exposed, more ordinary. Just rows, just mounded soil, just potato plants reaching up in the late August heat. Rowan walked the length of it in the dark with a flashlight, checking the row ends, making sure the debris was clear and the soil was undisturbed enough for the ducks to move freely. He did the whole field, all 3 acres, which took longer than he expected and left him at the far north end in the dark with the flashlight dimming and the field behind him. He stood there for a moment. The valley was quiet. The lights of other farms were visible to the south and east, distant, ordinary, the specific loneliness of seeing other people's ordinary lives from far away when your own is anything but. Bowers' place was dark. Henderson's was lit in a way that suggested someone was awake, which could mean anything on a farm at this hour. He walked back to the house. They were in the field before the sun cleared the ridge. Talia went to the barn first and brought the flock out in a group, all 63, stumbling and tilting in the early light, climbing over each other at the barn door with the specific ungainliness of animals that have never learned to do anything gracefully. She walked them to the north end of the field and stood at the head of the first row and gave 3 notes on the whistle. The ducks sorted themselves. Not perfectly, not the way a trained dog would. There was jostling and crowding, and 2 of them walked the wrong direction for a few steps before correcting, but they sorted. They found the row. They started moving. Rowan was at the south end, positioned at the base of the first row's plants, and he reached in and shook the stem the way Talia had described. Not hard, not rough, just enough to disturb whatever was sitting on the leaves or in the axils. He shook 3 plants in quick succession and looked down at what fell. Larvae. More than he'd expected, even now. Small, pale, moving in the disturbed soil. The lead duck was already on them. He watched it happen. The duck's head dropping, the quick sideways snap, once, twice, then 3 more birds crowding in behind, all of them nose down in the row, competing for what he'd dislodged. They moved through fast, faster than the corridor system had allowed because there was no structure to slow them, just open row and momentum. Talia was already halfway down the row ahead of them, whistling them forward. They worked like that all morning, row by row, Rowan shaking stems on the south end, Talia walking the north end and calling the flock through with the whistle. The ducks moved in a loose, urgent mass, flowing from row to row as Talia shifted, responding to the sound in the way they'd learned over 3 months of corridor training. The whistle meant follow, meant food, meant keep moving. In the open field, without the narrowing effect of the corridors, they spread wider, covered more ground, worked faster. By mid-morning, Rowan's back was screaming from the crouching and his right hand was raw from the stem shaking, and he'd lost count of how many rows they'd done. He straightened up at the end of a row and looked at the flock moving ahead of Talia into the next section and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Patch was near the front. He could spot her by the dark marking, the one he'd named her for back in June, when she was a thin, uncertain bird in a borrowed crate. She was not thin now. She moved through the row with a confidence that came from repetition, and something that looked almost in the specific delusion of a tired man watching a duck, like purpose. "Move up," Talia called from the far end. "They're pulling ahead." He moved up. The heat came on hard by noon. They didn't stop. Talia gave the ducks water at a trough. They moved along the field edge, which took 15 minutes, and then she got them moving again. Rowan ate half a sandwich standing up at the field edge and didn't taste it. The afternoon was worse, not because the work was harder, but because the tiredness compounded, the way it did when you'd been going at full effort for half a day and the other half was still in front of you. Rowan found himself making small errors, shaking the wrong plant, losing his position in the row, once crouching down and then having to hold the crouch for 30 seconds because his legs told him they were reconsidering. He pushed through it because there wasn't a choice. They lost 3 ducks to distraction around 2 o'clock. 3 of them decided that the field edge was more interesting than the row they were supposed to be working and wandered into the unplanted border section. Talia saw it before Rowan did and moved to intercept, and 2 of the 3 came back to the whistle. The third, one of the bigger males, a bird Rowan had privately thought of as consistently uncooperative, sat down in the border grass and refused to move for 10 minutes. Talia stood over it. "Come on," she said. The duck looked at a point somewhere to the left of her, the way near-blind animals always looked, slightly off from where you actually were. "I know you're tired," she said. "I'm tired too. Get up." Rowan, 20 feet away, said nothing. The duck got up. Whether it was the tone of her voice or simple chance, it stood, tilted its head, and walked back to the row. "Did you just talk a duck out of a sit-down strike?" Rowan said. "Shut up and shake the stems," Talia said. He shook the stems. By the time the light started going in the early evening, they had covered 2/3 of the field. It was more than Rowan had thought they could do. He stood at the row end and did the math, what remained against what the flock had processed, and the number was tight, genuinely tight, but possible if tomorrow went as well as today had. He looked at Talia. She was walking the last ducks of the evening rotation back toward the barn, the flock moving in a loose stream ahead of her, and she was limping slightly. She'd turned her ankle on a furrow around 3 o'clock and hadn't said anything about it, just kept moving. He'd watched her compensate all afternoon without mentioning it, and she hadn't mentioned it either. He walked over and fell in beside her. "How's the ankle?" he said. "It's fine. You've been favoring it since 3. I know. It's fine. She paused. It hurts, but it's functional. He didn't say anything more about it. They walked the ducks to the barn and locked them in and stood outside in the cooling evening air. The field was dark behind them now, and the valley below was going quiet. Somewhere to the south, a light was on in one of the other farmhouses. 2/3, he said. That's better than I thought. We need to start before sunrise tomorrow, she said. Earlier than today. We need the full day. I'll set the alarm. She nodded. Stood there for a moment, not moving toward the house. He looked at her. We're going to make it, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It just came out. She turned to look at him, and in the last of the evening light, her face did something he hadn't seen in a long time. The set jaw and the careful expression she wore most of the time loosened just for a second. Not a smile. Something more complicated than a smile. The look of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just allowed themselves, briefly, to consider the possibility of putting it down. Maybe, she said. Ask me tomorrow night. They went inside. He set the alarm for 4:15. The house was quiet except for the sounds a house makes when it's been lived in hard. The tick of cooling metal, the particular silence of a place where two people are just barely keeping everything together. He was asleep before he finished the thought he'd started. Outside in the dark field, the rows stood unguarded and open and still, waiting for what the morning would bring. The alarm went off at 4:15 and Rowan was already awake. He'd been lying there for 20 minutes, not anxious exactly, just present in that particular pre-dawn way where the mind runs through the day's work before the body has fully committed to being alive. He went through the field in his head, the remaining third, the rows they hadn't covered, the sections where the larvae pressure had been highest in his last check. He counted the hours of daylight against what he estimated they needed, and the math came out close enough to workable that he got up without the usual argument with himself about 5 more minutes. Talia was already in the kitchen. She had the lamp on low and was drinking coffee over her map, which she'd revised again the night before. The field redrawn without the corridor markers, just open rows and zone numbers and the rotation path she'd plotted for the flock's final 2-day run. She'd been asleep when he got up to check the time at 3, and she was awake now at 4:15, which meant she'd either slept 3 hours or woken before him and not bothered to tell him. How long have you been up? He said. Doesn't matter. He poured coffee and didn't push it. Her ankle was wrapped. She'd done it herself with the elastic bandage from the first aid kit, a neat job that said she'd been thinking about it before she did it. She was favoring it less than yesterday, which was either because it was genuinely better or because she'd decided to stop letting it show. They were in the field before the sky had color. The ducks came out of the barn in the gray pre-light, that same loose stumbling mass, and Talia walked them to the north end start position in the dark and gave the whistle. The sound cut clear through the quiet morning air. The flock settled into its pattern, not instantly, never instantly, always that 30-second period of shuffling and tilting and apparent confusion before the collective decision kicked in. And they were moving. Rowan was already at the south end of the first remaining row. They worked in near silence for the first 2 hours, the only sounds the whistle and the ducks and the soft percussion of stems being shaken. The light came up slowly, and with it the heat, earlier than yesterday and heavier. By 7 o'clock it was already uncomfortable. By 8 it was the kind of hot that made every movement cost a little more than it should. The larvae were worse in the remaining section. He'd known they would be. These were the rows that had been waiting, the ones they hadn't gotten to in the corridor system before the fox destroyed it, and 3 months of egg hatching and larval development had done what it does when nothing is there to stop it. He shook the first stem in the first row, and what fell to the soil made him press his mouth together and say nothing. He looked up at Talia. She'd seen it too. She was 20 feet ahead, and she didn't stop moving, just adjusted the whistle pattern. Shorter intervals, tighter call, keeping the flock concentrated rather than letting them spread wide. They crowded into the row in response, and the front ducks hit the larvae cluster, and the row became briefly very loud with the sound of 63 ducks competing for the same patch of soil. It's worse up here too, she called back. I know, keep going. They kept going. The middle section took 3 hours. 3 hours for 8 rows, which was slower than they needed because the density of what the ducks were finding required multiple passes. Rowan would shake the stems, the flock would work through, and then Talia would bring them back for a second pass while Rowan moved to the next row, and the math of it kept threatening to outpace the daylight available. He didn't say this out loud. She knew it as well as he did. Around 10 in the morning, Marcus Webb's truck appeared on the county road. Rowan saw it from the far end of the field, the truck slowing, then stopping on the road shoulder. Marcus got out and stood at the fence line looking at the field, not approaching, just watching. Rowan was too far away to read his expression. He shook 2 more stems and moved up the row. 20 minutes later, 2 more vehicles had pulled over on the road. He noticed them the way you notice things when you're working hard at something else, peripherally, without full attention. A blue pickup he didn't immediately recognize, a sedan that belonged to one of the Marconi brothers, he thought, though he wasn't sure which one. Both parked on the shoulder. People standing at the fence. He didn't stop. He shook stems and moved up the row and let Talia handle the flock and tried not to think about who was watching or why. By noon, there were 7 vehicles on the road. Talia had seen them. She hadn't said anything about it either, just kept the flock moving with the same focused attention she'd had since 4:30 in the morning. But during the water break, when they walked the ducks to the trough at the field edge, she glanced toward the road and then back at the field without expression. "They're watching," Rowan said. "I know. Bauer's truck is one of them." "I saw." He handed her the water bottle she'd left on the fence post. "Does it bother you?" She drank, handed it back. "I don't have room for it to bother me right now." She capped the bottle. "They can watch. Come on. The ducks are drifting." 3 of the flock had wandered toward the fence line, drawn perhaps by the unusual gathering on the other side of it, turning their tilted heads toward the line of parked vehicles with the particular expression of near-blind animals trying to process something by sound and smell instead of sight. Talia whistled them back. They came. The final rows were the hardest, not because the larvae were worse there, though they were, but because by early afternoon the cumulative weight of 2 days at this intensity had reached the point where each individual task, crouching, shaking, moving, repositioning, required a separate decision to execute. Rowan's right hand had a blister on the palm that had opened and was raw. His lower back had stopped sending specific messages and had moved to a general broadcast of complaint that he'd learned to filter out. His boots were wet from the irrigation-damp soil, and his socks had given up sometime around 11. He didn't say any of this. Neither did Talia. They just kept working. The flock was tiring, too. He could see it in the way they moved, slightly slower in the afternoon than the morning, the head tilting more frequent, the snapping less quick. But they didn't stop. 63 near-blind ducks, 3 months trained and 2 days into the hardest work they'd ever done, kept moving through the rows because the whistle told them to, and because Talia walked ahead of them, and because this was, at this point, simply what they did. Patch was still near the front. She had been near the front for 2 days, and Rowan had stopped being surprised by it. He'd noticed early on that she moved with slightly more directness than the others, that when the flock clustered and jostled for position at a larvae-rich spot, she pushed to where she needed to be with a quiet persistence that did not require speed or aggression, just consistent forward pressure. She ate well. She didn't waste motion. He thought, not for the first time, that if people moved through problems the way that particular duck moved through a row, life would probably go somewhat better for everyone. He shook the second-to-last row at 3:40 in the afternoon. He knew it was the second to last because he'd been counting since noon, keeping the number in his head, the way you keep a number in your head, when the number is the only thing tethering you to the belief that the work will eventually end. 1 more. After this one more. He moved to the last row. Talia brought the flock around from the east end and lined them at the row entrance and looked at him from 40 feet away. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she gave the whistle and the ducks went in. He shook every stem in that final row. He shook each one with the same attention he'd given the first one, 2 days ago, in the gray pre-dawn. He worked from south to north, and the flock worked from north to south, and they met in the middle in a press of bodies and noise and soil, and then the ducks moved through to the south end, and Talia walked them out into the clear field edge, and the row was done, and the field was done. And Rowan straightened up at the north end and stood there, his back, his hand, his feet. He stood there anyway. On the county road, the line of vehicles had grown to 11. People were standing along the fence in groups, talking quietly among themselves, and some of them had been there long enough that they'd gone back to their trucks for water and come back again. He could see Marcus Webb. He could see Phil Bauer. He could see two of the Marconi brothers standing together with the specific posture of men who were looking at something they didn't quite know how to categorize. He could see Silas Granger. Granger was parked at the far end of the line, his green truck pulled onto the shoulder, and he was standing at the fence alone. Not talking to anyone, just standing and looking at the field. And his hands were in his jacket pockets and his face was doing something that Rowan couldn't fully read from this distance. Talia came across the field toward him, the flock trailing behind her in the loose, dispersed way they moved when the work was done, and there was no road to follow. She reached him and stopped. She was dirty and sweaty, and her braid had mostly come apart, and she was limping a little again, the ankle having apparently used up its willingness to cooperate for the day. She looked at the field. He looked at it too. It was not beautiful exactly. The rows were trampled in places. The soil was churned from 2 days of 63 pairs of feet working through it. The plants were not perfect. They never had been, not once in this whole season. But they were standing. They were whole. The leaves held their green and the mounded rows held their shape, and the damage the larvae had done in the unworked sections was visible but bounded, contained, enough of the crop intact to matter. "How bad is the north section?" Talia said. "It'll cost us something," Rowan said. "Maybe 15% of that section. The larvae had a head start." She nodded. "The rest is good," he said. "Better than good." She kept looking at the field. One of the ducks walked up and stood beside her left boot, which it did occasionally for reasons that apparently made sense to it. She didn't look down at it. "We did it," Rowan said. He said it quietly, not triumphantly. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was the kind of moment where you say the true thing in a flat voice because the truth is large enough without decoration. "We did it," she said. He wasn't sure exactly when Silas Granger walked over from the road, but he became aware of the man's presence at the field edge the way you become aware of a change in weather. Not a single moment, but a gradual weight of attention that makes you turn and look. Granger was standing at the gap in the fence line where the farm road met the county road, and he was looking at the field the way he'd looked at it back in July, when he'd driven in uninvited and told Rowan it wouldn't work. Except it wasn't the same look at all. The July look had been the look of a man confirming a verdict he'd already delivered. This look was the look of a man standing in front of evidence he couldn't argue with and knowing it. Rowan walked over. Granger didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the rows. He looked at the ducks, who were moving in their dispersed, unhurried way across the worked field, still hunting, still nosing at the soil, because that was what they did. He looked at the fence line where his own land began, a quarter-mile south where his fields lay. And Rowan didn't look toward Granger's operation, but he knew what was there, had heard enough from Marcus and others to know that the beetle season had not been kind to anyone who'd relied on conventional methods. "Your field's standing," Granger said. It came out as a simple statement, no particular tone on it. "Yes," Rowan said. Another silence. Granger pulled his hands from his pockets and crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, then put his hands back in his pockets. A man trying to find the right posture for a conversation he hadn't planned on having. "I was wrong," he said. Rowan waited. "About the ducks. About—" Granger stopped. "About what I said to people, the welfare situation. I said things that weren't based on what I actually saw." He paused. That wasn't right. It was, Rowan knew, a significant thing for Silas Granger to say, not because the man was incapable of acknowledging error in private, but because he was saying it here, in earshot of the people who had gathered along the fence, Marcus and Bauer and the Marconi brothers and the others who had come through the afternoon to watch. Saying it here meant saying it in the one place where it would travel the same way the original rumor had traveled, through the same network, in the opposite direction. Rowan looked at him. Granger's face was the face of a man who had been right about enough things for long enough that being wrong had a particular cost for him, and who was paying it anyway. "I appreciate that," Rowan said. Granger looked at the field again. "Your wife designed the system?" "Her idea, her design. She built most of it herself." Granger nodded slowly. "I've been farming this valley 30 years, he said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite defeat and wasn't quite admiration, something between them. 30 years and I never thought about ducks. Rowan didn't fill that with anything. Let it sit. She around? Granger said. Rowan looked back at the field. Talia was at the far end, crouching at the base of a plant in the north section, checking the damage in the area they'd been late getting to. Her braid was loose and she had dirt on both knees, and she was writing something in the account book, which she had apparently had in her jacket pocket the whole time. She's working, Rowan said. Granger almost smiled. It didn't quite form, but it moved across his face in the direction of a smile. Yeah, he said. I can see that. He stayed at the fence for another few minutes and then walked back to his truck without ceremony, and Rowan watched him go and then turned back to the field. The people along the fence had been quiet during the exchange, the specific quiet of people who had heard something and were processing its implications. Phil Bauer caught Rowan's eye as he walked back into the field and gave a small nod. Marcus Webb was writing something in his phone, which meant it would be at the cooperative by morning. Rowan walked across the worked soil to where Talia was crouching. Granger came, he said. I heard. She didn't look up from the account book. He said he was wrong, in front of everyone. She wrote something. What did you say? That I appreciated it. She nodded. That was the right thing. She stood up slowly, her ankle registering its objection. She looked at what she'd written. Damage assessment numbers, crop viability estimates, the beginning of the calculation that would tell them what they had and what it was worth. North section is going to come in at around 80%. The rest, she looked at the field. The rest is going to be fine, better than fine. How much of the debt does that cover? She did the math in her head, the way she always did, that 2-second pause while the numbers ran. All of it, she said. If the price holds where it was last week. He looked at her. All of it. With something left over. She said it without drama, in the same flat voice she used for everything true. Not a lot, but something. He stood there for a moment. The afternoon light was coming in low from the west now, the heat finally beginning to release, and the valley below was going gold and amber in the evening colors. The ducks moved through the spent rows behind them, unhurried, some of them already beginning to cluster toward the barn end of the field in the way they did when the day was winding down. 63 near-blind birds that nobody had wanted, that an entire valley had called a joke, that an $18 purchase and 3 months of work and 2 days of desperate open field running had turned into the only functioning pest management operation in Ashmore Valley. Patch walked past them both and headed for the barn without waiting for the whistle. She knows, Talia said. Yeah, Rowan said. She's been ahead of the curve all season. Talia looked at him sideways. It was a look that had something in it, tiredness and something that wasn't quite amusement but was related to it. You've been talking to that duck again. Strategically, he said. For morale purposes. She turned and started walking toward the barn. He fell in beside her. Behind them, the rest of the flock came along in its loose, tilting way, navigating by sound and smell, and the particular sense that had carried them through 100 rows of this valley's hardest summer. And the field they'd worked stood behind them in the last of the evening light, imperfect, marked by the season, alive. From the county road, the line of vehicles was breaking up. Engines starting, trucks pulling back onto the road, people heading home to their own operations and their own damaged harvests, and their own accounting of what this summer had cost. They would talk, and the talk would move through the valley the way talk always did. The story of the sink would be different in the morning than it had been this morning. Rowan knew it and didn't think too long about it, because there was still the barn to lock, and the ducks to settle, and the account book to finish, and dinner to make, and an ankle that needed ice, and a back that needed rest. The work wasn't done because the field was done. The work was the thing that kept going. But for the length of that walk, 50 feet from the last row to the barn door, in the late August evening, with the valley going quiet around them and 63 ducks at their heels, he let himself have it. The simple fact of it, the thing they had built and defended and almost lost and saved by abandoning and rebuilt in 2 days on nothing but a whistle and stubbornness. They had done it. He didn't say it again. He didn't have to. The harvest came in the last week of August, and it was not a perfect harvest. Rowan wanted to be clear about that afterward, when people started telling the story in ways that made it sound cleaner than it was. The north section came in at 78%, not the 80 Talia had estimated. The larvae damage in the rows they'd been late reaching had gone a little deeper than her field assessment had shown. 2 rows in the center section had root damage from the extended irrigation problems in July, unrelated to the beetles entirely, just bad luck and wet soil at the wrong time. The yield per acre was lower than the regional average for a good season. It was, however, the only yield in Ashmore Valley that year. That was the number that mattered. That was the number that changed things. Every other potato operation in the valley, Granger's included, had taken losses ranging from severe to catastrophic. The beetle season had been the worst in 20 years by the County Extension Office's formal assessment, a document that Sandra Poole filed in September and that circulated through the farming community with the quiet devastation of an official confirmation of what everyone already knew. Bauer had lost 60% of his early crop. The Marconi brothers had written off their entire late planting. Henderson's operation, already stretched from previous years, was in a position that involved conversations with a bank that nobody in his family wanted to be having. Rowan and Talia's 3 acres were not enough to supply the valley. They weren't even close. But they were something where everything else was nothing, and in that gap, between something and nothing, the price of what they'd grown went to a place that neither of them had planned for. The first buyer came the Thursday after the harvest finished, a distributor out of Millhaven named Art Cobb, who Rowan had spoken to once in the spring about theoretical future business, and who now arrived with a different kind of interest, the specific focused interest of a man who has a gap in his supply and one person in the region who can fill it. He sat at the kitchen table and put a number on the table, and Rowan looked at Talia, and Talia looked at the number and said, without particular inflection, "That's not what it's worth." Cobb revised the number upward. They went back and forth for 40 minutes. Talia did most of the talking, which Cobb had not expected, and which Rowan watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone observing a person operate in exactly the way they're built to operate. She was not aggressive about it. She was just precise. She knew what they had. She knew what the regional shortage meant for supply and demand. And she had done the arithmetic before Cobb arrived. She got to a number that was 18% above Cobb's opening offer, and she stopped there, because that was the number that made sense, and she wasn't interested in being greedy, just accurate. They shook hands at the kitchen table. After Cobb left, Rowan sat for a moment with the signed agreement in front of him. Talia was at the counter making coffee, her back to him. 18%, he said. He would have gone to 22, she said. But 18 was fair. You could have pushed. I know. She turned around. I didn't want to. We're going to do business with people in this valley for a long time. Starting by squeezing every dollar out of a shortage year isn't the way I want to start. She poured the coffee. We got enough. He looked at the number on the agreement. Enough was, in this case, a word that covered the entire operating debt, the spring loan, the equipment costs, the feed bills, the fence materials, all of it, with a remainder that was not large but was real. A buffer, the first one they'd had since they'd signed the deed on the sink. We're clear, he said. It came out slightly strange, slightly like he was testing the sound of the words. We're clear, she said. She set a cup in front of him and sat down. Don't celebrate too hard. We have to replant in the spring, and the soil needs amendment work before winter, and the barn panel. Talia. What? 5 minutes, he said. Let me have 5 minutes. She looked at him across the table. Then she picked up her coffee cup and held it up slightly, the smallest possible gesture in the direction of a toast. He touched his cup to hers. 5 minutes. It was, all things considered, enough. Og. The winter that followed was quieter than either of them expected, and not only because winter in the valley was always quiet. Something had shifted in the way Ashmore Valley looked at the sink and the people who farmed it. It wasn't dramatic. There was no ceremony, no moment where the community gathered and formally revised its opinion. It happened the way most real changes happen, in increments, through small interactions that each meant something slightly different than the ones before. Marcus Webb stopped prefacing things with the careful neutral tone he'd used all summer when relaying information that was not entirely friendly. He just talked to Rowan normally, the way he talked to anyone, and that normalcy was its own statement. Phil Bauer came by in late September. He stood in the driveway and looked at the barn and the field and asked if Talia had time to talk. She did. They sat on the porch for an hour, and Bauer asked questions he clearly felt some embarrassment about asking. About the corridor design, about the flock management, about the rotation schedule. And Talia answered them without making him feel the embarrassment, which Rowan noticed and thought was generous given the year they'd had. Bauer left with a hand-drawn copy of the rotation map and a list of suppliers for Indian runner ducks. He said thank you twice, which was once more than Rowan had expected from him. He was not the last. Through October and into November, a steady, irregular stream of valley farmers found reasons to stop at the sink. Some of them were direct about it. They wanted to know about the ducks, about the system, about what they could implement before next season. Others approached it sideways, stopping under the pretext of neighboring business, and then eventually getting around to the question they'd actually come to ask. Talia handled all of them the same way, patiently, specifically, without condescension and without the satisfaction she might have been entitled to feel. She answered what she knew and said plainly when she didn't know something, and she gave away the information without charge because, as she told Rowan one evening, sharing what works is not a competitive disadvantage if you do it right. He wasn't sure he fully agreed with that, economically speaking, but he understood what she meant. The hardest visit came on a gray November morning when Silas Granger's green truck turned into the driveway. Rowan was splitting wood at the side of the house when he heard it. He watched Granger park and get out and stand for a moment looking at the property, at the barn, at the field put to rest for winter, at the house, with an expression that Rowan still couldn't fully read at distance and wasn't sure he could read up close either. He set the axe down and walked over. "Mr. Granger?" "Mercer." Granger looked at him. "I'd like to talk to your wife, if she's available." Talia was inside. Rowan went in and found her at the kitchen table with the soil amendment calculations she'd been working through all week, numbers that would determine what they added to the north section before spring planting. She looked up when he told her, and something moved across her face that he couldn't entirely name. Not reluctance, not quite, but an awareness of the weight of the conversation she was about to have. "Okay," she said. She capped her pen and went outside. Rowan stayed in the doorway. He could see them but not hear them from there, which felt like the right distance, present enough if something was needed, far enough to let it be what it was. Granger talked for a while. Talia listened. Then she talked and Granger listened. At one point, Granger took something from his jacket pocket, a folded piece of paper, and handed it to her, and she unfolded it and looked at it and folded it back. At another point, she said something that made Granger look at the ground for a moment. They talked for 25 minutes. When it was done, they shook hands at the driveway's edge, not warmly, not coldly, just two people who had been on opposite sides of a hard season and had found, somewhere in it, a place to stand that wasn't opposition. Granger got back in the truck and left. Talia came inside and set the folded paper on the kitchen table. Rowan looked at it. "What is it?" he said. "A formal letter of withdrawal." She sat down. The welfare complaint he was building. He filed a retraction with the county office last week, apparently. He brought me a copy. She looked at the paper. He said he should have done it in August when Sandra Poole filed her report. Rowan was quiet for a moment. That's more than I expected from him. He also asked about next year. She picked up her pen again. He wants to know if he can purchase ducks from us, if we expand the flock over winter. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. She opened the soil amendment notebook. I said the price would reflect our costs honestly, and I wasn't going to underprice because he asked. Rowan looked at her. What did he say to that? He said that was fair. She started writing. He seemed tired. The season was hard on his operation. I think this year cost him something that wasn't just money. Rowan sat down across from her. He thought about Silas Granger standing at the fence line in August, watching the field, with his hands in his pockets and the look of a man accounting for something. 30 years of being right, and then one season of a different kind of right running through the middle of his valley and proving itself in the one currency that farmers ultimately trusted, which was surviving when everything else didn't. Are you going to sell him ducks? Rowan said. Probably, Talia said. Yes. She kept writing. That's not forgiveness, in case you're wondering. That's just business and sense. If the system works, it should work for the whole valley. The Beetles don't care whose field they're in. He thought about that. And you can just You can separate those two things that cleanly. She looked up. No, she said honestly. Not entirely, but I can act like I can. And mostly that's enough, Shettim. The flock spent the winter in the expanded barn stall Rowan built in October. A proper setup this time, with better ventilation and a reinforced side panel that no fox was getting through without a construction permit. He added 6 inches of fresh straw every week. He fixed the water system so it didn't freeze in the January cold. He talked to them, still, in the low, one-sided way he'd developed over the summer, not out of any theory about animal behavior, just because it was quiet in the barn in the morning and it felt less quiet with words in it. Patch had a settled quality now that she hadn't had in June. She moved through the barn with the certainty of space that came from knowing it completely, every inch of it mapped in the way near-blind animals map the world, by repetition and memory and the particular confidence that comes from having navigated somewhere long enough to stop being uncertain about it. She ate well. She bullied the smaller ducks away from the best corner of the straw, which was not admirable but was consistent with her general approach to life. Rowan had told Talia once, sometime in November, that he thought Patch was the reason the system had worked. Talia had looked at him with the expression she reserved for ideas that were both wrong and somehow not entirely wrong. "She's one duck," she said. "She was always at the front," he said. "The others followed her more than they followed the whistle, some of the time." "That's probably true," Talia said, "but she was at the front because she was hungry and confident, not because she had a plan." Maybe that's all leadership is. She'd thought about it. "Maybe," she said. "That's a depressing thought." "Or a reassuring one," he said. "Depending." He thought about that conversation more than once over the winter. He thought about what the whole season had actually been, stripped of the narrative that was already forming around it in the valley. The story of the blind ducks and the willow corridors and the impossible harvest, which was becoming, in the retelling, somewhat more elegant than it had been in the living. The living had been exhaustion and doubt, and a fox in the barn at 2 a.m. and a back that still wasn't entirely right in December. The living had been Talia's ankle and the damaged zone 4, and the account book math at midnight, and the specific terror of standing in the last row of the last day and not knowing, even then, if it had been enough. The story people told was cleaner. He understood why. Clean stories were easier to carry. But he wanted to remember the actual thing, the part where it wasn't certain, where it could have failed, where they'd been 2 people with $18 worth of ducks, and a pencil map, and a season that didn't care about their plan. That version seemed more important to hold on to, not because suffering deserved commemoration, but because the actual version was the true one. And the true one was the one that could help somebody else, someday, who was standing in their own field with a bad option and an idea that everyone around them thought was a joke. By February, they had placed orders for 30 additional Indian runner ducks, 12 from a breeder in the next county, 18 from a cooperative that Sandra Poole had connected them with after she'd visited twice more in the fall, both times with questions about the system that were less inspection and more genuine curiosity. The new birds would arrive in April, before planting, giving Talia time to begin the training cycle before the season made it urgent. She'd also been asked, through the cooperative, to present at the Regional Agricultural Extension meeting in March. She'd said no the first time the request came, and yes the second time, after Rowan pointed out that saying no was a form of the same pride that had kept other farmers from considering her system in the first place. She had not immediately appreciated that observation. "That's not the same thing at all," she said. "It's a little bit the same thing." "It isn't. You're protecting yourself from being wrong in public," he said, which is exactly what "don't finish that sentence." He didn't finish it, but she sent the email saying yes. The presentation was 30 minutes on a Tuesday evening in the meeting room above the Millhaven Cooperative, and it was attended by 22 farmers, 2 bank representatives, Sandra Poole, and Silas Granger, who sat in the back row and did not ask questions, but whose presence was noted by everyone in the room and said more than a question would have. Talia was not a natural public speaker. She talked too fast at first, and her voice flattened when she was nervous, losing the animation it had in private conversation. But she knew the material. She had always known the material. And when she got to the part about the rotation schedule and started explaining the logic of the zone design, the room went quiet. In the specific way rooms go quiet when people are actually following what's being said. She showed them the account book numbers. She showed them the before and after pest density measurements from the east section. She explained the corridor design and then explained why it was ultimately unnecessary, why the training was the thing, why the corridors were scaffolding and not structure. A farmer named Ruth Adler from the east edge of the valley raised her hand. "What was the hardest part?" she asked. "Not technically, just what was actually the hardest part?" Talia paused. She looked at her notes, then back up. "Not knowing if it was going to work until it did," she said. "There's no version of this where you have certainty in advance. You do the thing you've thought through as carefully as you can, and you stay in it, and you try to adjust when it breaks, and you don't stop." She paused again. "And it will break. Parts of it will break. That's not a failure, that's just the season." The room was quiet for a moment after that. Rowan, sitting in the third row, looked at his wife at the front of the room, tired and precise and telling the truth without ornamentation, and thought about a June morning when she'd crouched in the dirt between two potato rows and turned over a clod of earth and found something that could have ended everything they'd built, and decided instead that it was the beginning of a solution. She had not known it would work. She had not had certainty or guarantee or proof. She had looked at what was in front of her and thought about it more carefully than anyone else was willing to, and then she had acted on what she'd thought. That was it. That was the whole of it. Not genius, not luck, just attention. The willingness to look at something everyone else had decided was worthless and ask, seriously, without embarrassment, what it might be good for. The willingness to be wrong in front of people and keep going anyway. The willingness to abandon the thing you built when the situation required something different, and to trust that what you'd learned in the building was more valuable than the structure itself. The sink was still the sink. The soil was still rocky on the northeast corner, and the drainage was still difficult, and the frost still came early. The farm was not transformed into something easy. It was just theirs, with all the complication that involved, and the work of it would continue for as long as they chose to do it. But in the barn, 63 near-blind ducks, soon to be 93, were settled in their straw, mapping their small, certain world by touch and sound and repetition. Patch was in her corner, eating more than her share as usual, planning nothing, needing nothing, moving through her days with the simple, directed confidence of a creature that had found its purpose and was using it. She did not know what she had been part of. She did not know about the loan, or the account book, or the line of trucks on the county road, or the presentation in the meeting room above the cooperative. She did not know that her particular stubborn way of moving through a row, nose down, forward, persistent, indifferent to what anyone watching thought about it, had looked to a tired man shaking plant stems in a field at the end of a long summer, like the truest version of how to get through something hard. She just knew the straw and the water and the rows that waited in the spring, the smell of turned soil and the particular satisfaction of a beak, finding what it was built to find. It was enough. It had always been enough. And on the other side of the barn wall, the valley lay quiet under February dark, waiting, as all exhausted things eventually do, for the season to turn.